Welcome everyone to another episode of the S.O.A.P. Today we're going to do a retro episode, so of course I've got my co-host Aaron, our retro specialist. Welcome Aaron.
Hey guys, glad to be back having a chat about some retro stuff this week, which is pretty cool.
We started this episode because I got reminded by the Commodore 64, which has its own little mini version coming out, and it reminded me that we'd said a couple of times we're going to do a NES episode and we haven't done it yet. So Aaron, retro games, are they coming back? Are they a big thing? I see more and more about them. Is it popular or is it just the odd article here and there?
No, it's definitely very popular at the moment. Everything old is new again in the gaming world. We've got so many different mini consoles, classic consoles, reboots of old games and everything coming back now as a lot of the people that grew up with these games, so, you know, your people that were sort of kids in the 80s and 90s and now sort of becoming 30, 40 years old and they're wanting to relive the old Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64 that they had as a kid and has been lost or sold or broken and doesn't work anymore. No matter how much you blow on the cartridge, it just won't play. And these guys have now got, you know, jobs, families, they're grown-ups, and it's like, well, I used to play Mario Brothers until my fingers bled on my Nintendo back in the day, so I want to really get back into that. I want to capture my childhood. I guess the world is now full of, you know, 30 to 40-year-old grown children that just want to play some Mario again, and I think companies are really starting to cash in on that. You mentioned the Commodore 64 Mini, which will be released sometime this year. No one really knows. It looks pretty cool. It's a tiny little thing about the size of a pocket calculator that looks like a Commodore 64, and it's got 30 or 40 games on it. It's got a HDMI output, so it plugs into a modern TV, and you can play those old Commodore 64 games, obviously, hopefully without the waiting and the loading times that the Commodore 64 used to have. But anyway, I digress. So I really think everything old is new again. The rise of the hipster, you know, I played the Nintendo before it was cool kind of thing has probably helped that as well, but definitely not a fad. It's only getting bigger and better. So definitely looking at a wave of retro nostalgia. We're going to have a look at probably just the two main ones tonight, I think, Dan, if that's okay. The NES Classic and the Super NES Classic, or the SNES Classic.
All right, well, Aaron, I believe you've actually had a go at both the NES and the SNES. Can you tell us when you played them, what it was like, what was that experience, and did it recapture your childhood?
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, I first got my hands on an NES Mini, the original one, the one that had all of that hype and the massive sort of following that Nintendo built up a couple of Christmases ago when it was launched, and a good friend of mine was having some Christmas drinks, and we were, you know, sitting around, having a few beers, a bit of Christmas cheer, really enjoying ourselves, and he basically came along and he pulled this tiny little box out and he goes, "Look what I've got, dude." And I was like, "Oh, is that the NES Mini?" He's like, yeah, so let's play it. And a few beers in, of course, we're like, yep, absolutely. I was the master at Donkey Kong, so I'm going to kick your ass, right? And, you know, we're going to play some Bubble Bobble, and it's going to just be awesome. Anyway, so he pulls it out of the box, and the first thing that struck me, right, was the size of the damn thing. Now, I'd seen plenty of articles online, plenty of ads, plenty of everything, and it looked big-ish, you know, like, I don't know how big, what could I compare it to? Maybe the size of a few packets of noodles stacked on top of each other. That's a horrible size comparison, but that'll...
Do you think as a kid you could ever imagine, because obviously at the time when they made them as small as possible, do you think as a kid you could ever imagine the advancements in technology to the point that we have more powerful consoles and smaller versions as well? Do you think as a kid you could ever imagine where it was back then to where it is now?
No, I think we tried to sort of imagine, you know, amazing computer systems or games that we might be playing when we were older, but they were all sort of based on what we were playing at that time. So there was before the time of 3D games. So we thought we're going to have these amazing platform, you know, 2D games. So they're going to have photorealistic graphics. We didn't even have an idea of what a 3D game was because we didn't have a point of reference. And I remember when I got my Super Nintendo, I thought, this is the tits. nothing's going to get better than this. Look how bloody good this looks. This is absolutely amazing. And I thought that was it. I thought that was like the pinnacle of gaming technology, and we're pretty much going to be playing Super Nintendos for the rest of our life. And I was obviously very wrong about that.
The other thing is, whenever you look at any kind of futuristic thing, and we even go back to 80s, when they had a look at the future, it was always, how do we make things bigger and better and more interactive? But reality is, going from the 80s to today, we've just gone backwards and remade what we had, but better.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's exactly what we had back then, but it's better. The consoles, the classic consoles, are updated to work on new flat screen TVs, which were a thing of science fiction when we had the original Nintendos. You can get wireless controllers for them, which is something that we had no idea you could have back then. I mean, having a wireless phone was pretty amazing back in the 80s, let alone a wireless controller for your Nintendo. Stereo sound, I know that's probably really boring, but a lot of the original games are in mono because of the hardware.
An 8-bit sound.
8-bit sound. Now we've got beautiful DVD quality sound with everything. A little aside, if you plug an original Nintendo into a LCD TV or a flat panel TV through the original RF adapter, you'll actually get this really awesome hum. It comes from the RF adapter, and it's because of the way it translates the video signal to a TV signal that the TV can break down. That's if you can find an LCD TV that's still got TV tuner built into it.
Well, I suppose that's a good segue into the hardware for these devices. We've talked about how much we've advanced in that. Can you tell me what the new ones are like, and maybe give us a look at how that compared to what they were like originally?
The NES Classic and the Super NES Classic are basically running the exact same system and motherboard, just with a few little tweaks and changes here and there. So they're what are called a system on a chip, or a SOC, an SoC, okay, where everything is basically built into one chip or one CPU for cost effectiveness. So it's actually a 4-core ARM Cortex A7 chip.
That's a lot of talk.
So basically it's, the very, very early Android smartphones that were just starting to go quad-core and dual-core, probably around that sort of speed. I'm just trying to see if I can actually get a clock speed for you, but ARM aren't really talking, so I can't give you an exact clock speed. I can tell you that the onboard graphics processor is a 400 megahertz graphics processor, so not hugely fast, but fast enough to render the 8-bit graphics. Now, it does have half a gigabyte of flash storage, so like basically a hardwired SD card, a 512 meg SD card on board, and 256 meg of DDR3 memory. So more than enough power there to run the system emulation of either the Super Nintendo or the Nintendo. Plenty of storage to fit all of the games on. So there's 30 games on the Nintendo Mini. There's 21 on the SNES Mini. I'll talk a little bit about that more in a moment. So there's also enough power to upscale everything to run across HDMI and stereo sound, and to provide the menus and stuff, because it's got a nice menu front end system. I don't see it where you can sort of flick across and it'll show you the picture of the box and a little description of the game. Now, do you want to hazard a guess at any of the hardware in the original Nintendo?
I've got no idea, if I'm going to be honest, but was it... I think it was Bill Gates who said something like 640K is all the memory we'll ever need. Is it something like that?
Absolutely, he was quoted as saying 640K is all the memory a home computer will ever need. So I've kind of read out those specs there. So half a gig of storage, 256 meg of memory, processor that's probably running in around the 500 to 700 megahertz mark. The Nintendo Entertainment System, which was released in the early 80s, contained what was called an MOS 6502 8-bit processor, which was very, very popular in everything from electronic keyboards to calculators. I believe the 6502 was even used in some Commodore computers as a sound chip as well. But the NES had onboard memory of 2 kilobytes. Okay, so
yep.
The NES Classic has 2,046 kilobytes of memory as opposed to 2 kilobytes of memory for the Nintendo. So there's definitely enough memory in the newer ones to run most NES games on the old one. The processor ran at about 2 hertz, not megahertz, 2 hertz. It was very, very slow as well. The display resolution was 256 by 240 pixels. So standard high definition television is 1080 by 1900-ish pixels.
Let's not mention a 4K one.
Let's not mention 4K. So you can imagine just how much less technology is actually in a Nintendo for what it did back then. Your standard cartridges were between 4 and 8 kilobytes of solid state storage, which made the cartridges load almost instantly. That was always one thing about cartridge-based systems, is you put the cartridge in, turn it on, the game is loaded. So they were basically like the original SSD drive.
Now, the issue with those was the cost to make a cartridge, and that's why we moved away. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's more or less correct. It was always dearer to make custom chips that go on a custom board, that go in a custom plastic case than it is to burn a CD. That is why we did move away from cartridges. Nintendo, though, for their credit, they did move away from cartridges for a little while. Then sort of now with the Switch, they've gone back to a quasi-cartridge. It's like a little memory card that goes into the Switch now. So it's not a disc, it's an actual cartridge. And a lot of us don't use discs anymore. We just download our games from, various game services.
Reputable ones.
Exactly right. So we've come a long way. It's interesting. I'm not going to bore anyone with any more details. Basically, the NES Mini and the Super NES Mini are seriously overpowered. If we had that kind of processing power in the 80s when the NES was released, we'd probably be, colonizing Jupiter or something by now. But they are seriously overpowered. But it is interesting to note that both boards, the NES Classic and the SNES Classic, are more or less identical. They didn't need to put more hardware in to emulate the SNES. Now, there is a couple of games that SNES Classic won't emulate because the Super Nintendo actually had an add-on chip that went in some cartridges called a Super FX chip. So if you've ever played Star Fox and Doom on the Super Nintendo, they had an extra processor in the cartridge. The hardware can't emulate that correctly, but there are software hacks which they've done to get Star Fox and Star Fox 2 onto the Super Nintendo Classic. Obviously, the games look better as well. That's due to just the fact that these boards have enough power to actually upscale that 240 odd pixel picture up to high def resolutions as well. So they're very plug and play, whereas back in the old days you had to plug in the TV adapter, as I said, and tune in a channel before you could even see the picture on your TV. Pretty much went with the tried and tested design of the controllers. Are pretty much exactly the same controllers. They didn't change much. They didn't add extra buttons or anything like that.
Yep.
There might be a reset button, I think, but that's just more of a matter of necessity rather than changing a classic design. So the Nintendo Mini has the exact same Nintendo controller, same size, same everything. The only unfortunate thing I found while playing these is the cords are far too short on the controllers.
Can you stretch them?
You'd probably snap them. We did find, when I was playing with my mate, that Wii controller extension leads, so the actual controller that goes from the nunchuck to the Wiimote, has the same plugs as they use in the Nintendo and Super Nintendo Classics, so Nintendo must have a warehouse full of these plugs floating around, because they used them on the Wii U as well. So you can actually use Wii extension leads. Now, I did mention before wireless controllers, and if you do have some third-party stuff like the 8-bit Do stuff, you can use your 8-bit Do controllers with an adapter that's got that special Wii plug on it, and I'm sure other companies make wireless adapters as well. But the controllers are great, but the cords are way too short. Now, there is a reason for that. In Japan, they don't have as much room as we do in Australia, obviously, so the houses are much smaller. So when people used to sit down and play their Nintendo, they would sit on the floor in front of their telly because their lounge rooms were much smaller. They didn't need long cords on their controllers.
Makes sense.
So Nintendo didn't make the cords very long, and there was a huge outcry once the NES Mini or Classic was released, because everyone said the controller cords are too short. So Nintendo really didn't do anything for the Super Nintendo. They basically left it the same-ish. I think they were a bit longer, but still nowhere near long enough, because, if you sit right in front of your 60-inch TV, it's going to burn out your eyes again. You really do need to sit back a bit from it so you can see the whole picture.
Yep.
You can get third-party controllers for it. They are very, very easy to find because of the popularity of these machines.
And if you are wondering about the 8-bit controller, I do believe we have a video on our channel that you can go watch and see what you get in the box.
Absolutely. The adapter for the Classics is an extra. It doesn't actually come with that, but you can certainly pick one up. And they've made a new one now to celebrate the release of the Super Nintendo Classic as well. It looks exactly like a Super Nintendo controller, in the same vein that the one we reviewed looks like a Nintendo controller, and I have both. And I can not recommend them highly enough.
Well, now that we got through the nitty-gritty part, let's talk about the fun stuff. Games. I assume there's plenty of games on there.
Oh, yes. So, well, let's start out with the Classic, the NES. 30 games. Okay, 30 games. And let me tell you, I wouldn't have wanted to be the guys in the room at Nintendo when someone walked in and said, right, we're going to re-release this Nintendo Mini. We've got 30 games. You guys need to curate 30 games out of the thousands that were released for the Nintendo. You need to pick the top 30, and you need to make sure that everyone's happy with that top 30. I reckon I would have jumped out the window. I would have been like, no, you can't pay me enough to do that.
How many people do you reckon stayed up all night just going, was that the right choice?
I reckon there's still people going, did I pick the right thing? It would have been a horrible task. And the list of games is pretty good. I must say that they came down to just the classics. Not the, the most popular, but the classics, and the ones that made the Nintendo what it was, I think.
Can you tell us what games on the NES were like? Because obviously they're very different to what we have today. Can you explain to people who may not have seen a NES or SNES game before what to expect as a general idea of the games?
As you mentioned, the games were very, very different back then. They were products of the hardware that was available at the time, and obviously that hardware is, not 3D accelerated or water cooled or anything like that. So it was more about playability, and on the whole, I'll put my opinion out that games were a lot harder back then as well. You got 5 lives, 3 continues, and that was it. There was none of this press X to retry. You had to learn the games, and you had to get through 30 levels without fucking it up, basically, because you only got 5 lives. But the games on a whole were 8-bit graphics. Now, everyone's seen the 8-bit style graphics that have had a big revival in a lot of games these days. So the blocky, pixelated graphics with not a great deal of colours on screen at once, and a lot of reusing of background sprites and things like that. So they were mainly side-scrolling platform games. So you would get the Super Mario Brothers, Contra kind of games where you were running from left to right, jumping on enemies' heads, jumping from platform to platform, with a very simple picture. It wasn't 3D. There wasn't any rendered face cutscenes or anything like that. They were just very, very basic, and you've all seen the retro pixel art, so that is where that came from. Without the Nintendo, we wouldn't have the modern game, though, I really do think. For instance, I did mention not many of these games had anything like cutscenes or 3D or anything, but the cutting edge was people trying this stuff out, and it didn't always work. There were games where the graphics were terrible, but they tried to make it sort of 3D-ish to make it look more immersive. The game Ninja Gaiden, just out of interest, was the first game ever to have a cutscene, and when that game came out and it had cutscenes between the levels, although admittedly they were a tiny little graphic with some text underneath them, people's minds were blown because they were like, oh, so I don't just run to the left and kill enemies. This has actually got a story. That paved the way for cutscenes, maybe not Hideo Kojima 30, 40-minute unskippable cutscenes, but it did definitely pave the way for cutscenes. Super Mario Brothers really put platforming games on the map. Contra games really put hard games on the map. So did Ninja Gaiden. So without those, we probably wouldn't have Dark Souls, but some people might argue that's probably not such a bad thing due to the hardness of the game. We wouldn't have cheats, codes, the famous Konami code, which is up, down, left, right, A, B, A, B, that a lot of games use as a cheat code or a skip code, came from the game Contra because it was too hard even for the developers with 5 lives, so that code gave you 30 lives instead of 5. There was other games like Final Fantasy was one of the first adventure games, closely followed by Legend of Zelda, which was your top-down dungeon crawling exploring game. But don't expect, like Far Cry, open worlds, Grand Theft Auto, Burnout Racing, anything like that. The games are very simplistic, very low resolution, very blocky graphics. You had to use your imagination, and they were very hard because basically they wanted you to continue playing this one game. So it wasn't always about, making it easier for the player. It was just about making games bloody hard, so you kept at it. Very addictive. Playability was a big thing. I've certainly got a top 5 that's going to surprise nobody. Dan's, yours is, well, probably not the same as mine. Why don't you lead it out? What's your top 5 of the NES library on the Mini?
All right, my top 5, probably not a surprise to anyone. They are the classics. Personally, the 30 games that they picked on the NES, I was very happy with it. They had the games that I was most looking forward to from that kind of era. So my top 5, not surprising. You've got Gallagher and Pac-Man. Obviously, you would have played them in the arcades.
Classics.
Yeah, they were so classic that you would have seen them everywhere, not just on the NES. And to be honest, I only had limited time on the NES as a child, which is normally at a mate's house. Things like that were easy go-to games because you'd seen them in other places. On top of that, you've got Donkey Kong. It birthed so much coming out of that with Mario. Donkey Kong is forever one of those games, and the references that you see in even like Adam Sandler movies and that. Donkey Kong changed so much, but that original Donkey Kong is something that can never be forgotten. And on top of that, Super Mario Brothers that came from it. Just such a classic game. The big one, though, for me is Bubble Bobble. I can't play enough of that game. Still to this day, I will go back and play it. Bubble Bobble is probably one of the most classic games, in my opinion, that anyone could ever play. And if you haven't, for some reason, played it, I would highly recommend whether you go back and get it on the NES or get it on another platform. Bubble Bobble is the must-play. And bring a friend. It's 1,000 times better with a second person. Yeah, so Bubble Bobble, absolute classic, and you're absolutely right. Bring a friend. It's much better in 2-player mode because then you've got someone to actually shout at when it gets really hard at about level 50. I mean, it's this cutesy, wonderful game, and it sucks you in, but about level 50. Now, there's 100 levels, mind you. Have you made 100 levels. I didn't misspeak. There's 100 bloody levels. About level 50, it gets hard as balls. Have you made it to 100? I have, with another friend. He's actually got a stand-up arcade machine. We basically took a Saturday afternoon and we played Bubble Bobble from beginning to end. Luckily, his machine doesn't take coins. It's got a button, so we could just keep putting coins into the machine until we finished the game. No, I wouldn't say we cheated. We put on infinite credits. I would call that cheating. I'm not going to lie. I spent enough time playing that game across multiple things, not just the NES, but the Commodore 64, arcade machines and that kind of stuff, that I actually finished it without extra coins, extra credits or anything like that. I did actually spend enough time that I did do it. But yeah, you would agree it's hard as balls. It does. It definitely, and there's nothing more panicking than when that timer starts to run out and you get that whale creature on the screen chasing you. Woo, woo, woo. Yeah. It's like, yep. That's the true meaning of stress. Absolutely. What about you, Aaron? What's your top 5 or best picks out of the classic NES? Okay, so for anyone that listens to the podcast with regularity, it's going to come as no surprise that Final Fantasy is on my list there. The first Final Fantasy, which was released originally in Japan, was the top-down exploring style of RPG. So it wasn't a platformer, it wasn't, anything like that. It's something that the Japanese have always sort of done, whether it be through card games, role-playing games, all of that. That was a translation into the Nintendo. It was a massive world, one of the first games that took hours and hours and hours and hours to play. A lot of the Nintendo games are designed to be beaten in an hour or two because you can't save. There was no save games. There was no, except in very limited games that had a battery, there was no save games. Final Fantasy was one of the few that did have a battery in it. It's the top-down Legend of Zelda
And everyone's probably seen maybe not Legend of Zelda on the Nintendo, but definitely Legend of Zelda on either the Game Boy or the Super Nintendo, that top-down style again, where you're wandering around cartoony worlds and you look down as if you were in a drone hovering over the heads of the characters. And when you go into battle, it changes to a battle screen and you've got your party on one side and the monsters on the other and a list of magic and attacks. And a great story. And the reason it was called Final Fantasy was not because it was the only one he was ever going to make. He wanted to say that this style of game would be the final word in fantasy games. So he was like, I have come up with a way to play these epic fantasy games on the Nintendo and make it really fun and really easy to use with a controller without a keyboard. And it's going to be the final method of playing these games.
With Final Fantasy, it's going to sound like a crazy person's question, but is Final Fantasy the first Final Fantasy? Because I know that some of the Final Fantasy numbers go out of order and change from country to country.
They do.
Is Final Fantasy number 1?
No, Final Fantasy on the NES is number 1. It's when we get to the Super Nintendo that things go batshit crazy with the numbering. But, speaking of numbering and things going batshit crazy, the next 3 on my list are obviously Mario 1, 2, and 3.
Classics?
Classics, yeah. You can't go away from Super Mario Brothers, Super Mario Brothers 2, and possibly the greatest platformer of all time, Super Mario Brothers 3. Also hard as balls, mind you. The reason I say that naming and numbering is something that's actually related to this is because Super Mario Brothers 2 in the West, so Australia, England, Europe, America, isn't actually a Mario Brothers game. It's a game called Doki Doki Panic, which has been reskinned. And if anyone's played Super Mario Brothers 2, you will notice that it's absolutely different to all the other Super Mario games where you're actually running around, you pull radishes out of the ground, throw them at enemies. All the enemies are completely different. There's no Goombas, there's no Bowser, or the levels tend to go up in the air, so you're climbing up rather than going left to right. There's doors that you can go into that take you into this mirror realm. There's keys. It's really, really different.
So what led to that?
Long story short is they released Super Mario Bros. 2 in Japan before they did in, let's just say, America, because that was the second biggest Nintendo market going. The guys in Japan released a Super Mario Bros. Sequel, which was basically more of the same of the original Super Mario Bros., but harder, with slightly better graphics, different enemies, more levels. They sent it to Nintendo America, and there was one guy that did the playtesting of the Japanese games. And he played it and he said, no, I don't like it. It's shit house. It's too hard. Americans are going to get shits with this and they're not going to play it. So Nintendo of Japan went, well, shit, what are we going to do? We're going to have to release Super Mario Bros. 2 because Super Mario Bros. And the Nintendo are the highest selling games of all time at this point. Everything was Nintendo and Super Mario Bros. Back then. And they needed a sequel and they needed it quick to cash in on it, obviously. So they looked around and they found this game called Doki Doki Panic, which was not as hard and slightly different, but kind of Mario-ish. They basically reskinned it. And one of the first things you notice when you play Super Mario Bros. 2 is you can select Mario, Luigi, Toad, or Princess Peach to play, rather than just Mario or Luigi. And Luigi's actually different. This is the game that actually cemented Luigi as the tall one that can jump higher. Before that, he was just Mario but green. So they released that to an American audience because they thought that it was going to bomb because it was just way too hard. It was like Super Mario Brothers but on steroids. And people kind of went, what? That's different. It's still sold in the billions, the trillions, like they sold a shitload of them. And it wasn't until later on, one of the guys from Nintendo actually said, yeah, you know what, we gamed you on. Super Mario Bros. 2 is actually a thing, and they re-released it when they brought out Super Mario All-Stars on the Super Nintendo, which was a reboot of Mario 1, 2, and 3. They called it the Lost Levels, and it's on that cartridge. So, anyway, but I love Super Mario Bros. 2 for what it is, and it's got a great soundtrack as well. It's got do-do-do-do-do-do. It's really, really upbeat, but it's not as iconic. And, of course, Super Mario Bros. 3, Nintendo went, right, okay, we're just going to go back to our roots. We're going to make it hard as balls. We're going to add all this new features. This is the first one that had Mario with different abilities, like being able to fly, and the Tanuki suit and all that sort of stuff. Yep. So they're obviously on my list. Mario 1, 2, and 3. Maybe Mario The Lost Levels is like a 2.5 there. If I could get a Japanese copy of Super Mario Bros. 2, I'd be very happy for my Nintendo. But yeah, like that's going to happen. Again, not to bore everyone, of course, my last game on that list is Legend of Zelda, which again cemented the fact that you didn't just have to have a platforming game or a fighting game or like a shooting game like Galaga as a computer game. It was one that said you can have this sprawling narrative and an adventure game on a system that is built for jump and run games and shooting games. And they went, no, let's break the mold. Let's actually get some narrative. Let's have a story, a fantasy game set in a fantasy world that takes hours to play and not just a quick afternoon. This is a game that will involve you. And Legend of Zelda, Final Fantasy, those games on the Nintendo were the original Skyrim. You always went back because there's always something else to do. There's always little areas you hadn't explored or a heart container you hadn't picked up. And Legend of Zelda and Final Fantasy were some of the first games to feature a battery backup, which is basically a watch battery in the cartridge. And Legend of Zelda was gold. The cartridge was gold as well, and so was Legend of Zelda 2. It was gold as well, so there's that. But that's my top 5.
Yeah, that's one thing I should probably clarify is that Legend of Zelda and Final Fantasy would have been in my top 5, except for the fact that at that time, growing up, I didn't own one. So when I went over to someone else's house, the quick, easier games were the ones that you were more likely to play because you could put them on quickly, play them for half an hour, and you were done. Whereas something like Legend of Zelda, which is something I did go back, years later and play, it was harder as someone who didn't own the console to go over to someone else's house and play that and get that same kind of experience.
That's something about the Nintendos and the Ataris and the Segas of the past. When you bought one, they always came with 2 controllers. These days, you buy a PlayStation or Xbox, they'll come with 1. Because back then, they were designed to be played together. And every game had a 2-player option.
Yep.
Now, on your newer consoles, of course, well, the console manufacturers want to make another $100 out of you by buying another controller, obviously. But they all came with the second controller because you're always going to play it with your mates. You're going to have someone come over or you're going to go over to their place and you're going to play Mario or Donkey Kong, 2-player co-op or a Bubble Bobble 2-player co-op rather, not Donkey Kong. It was one after the other, I think. And no, online, what was online, that was what you put the washing on. So your mum and dad would let you have a couple of hours of Nintendo in the afternoon. You'd have to go and hang the washing online. Otherwise, they wouldn't let you play it. They wouldn't let you have the TV. And a nice feature of both the SNES and the NES Classic is they both come with 2 controllers with cords that are far too short because then you and whoever you're playing with it are all up in each other's business. But I do remember being all up in my mate's business when we were playing originally back in the 80s as well. And, when it was their turn, you'd like put your hands on the controller or like thump them in the arm or tackle them and try and stop them getting a better score than you. So, maybe that's still relevant.
Well, how did games change going from the NES to the SNES? What was the big difference between the two?
All right. Obviously, the SNES was many years after the Nintendo. The Nintendo hung around for so long. It was just so popular, just forever, because it was just great. The SNES had better graphics. You could put more things on screen at once. So really quickly, back in the day, like, say your character of Mario, he was called a sprite. And everything that moved on the screen was a sprite. So the little turtle that he jumps on is a sprite. And the power of the hardware meant that they could only move so many sprites at a time. So when the screen got really full of sprites or bullets or enemies, it would slow down or flicker. And that was just because of the limitations of the hardware. So the Super Nintendo upped the sprite count, and that was one of its big things. It was more like, yep, we can have more on screen at once. It had a faster processor, so it could draw better graphics as well. So it could do more things more fast. And it was 16-bit, and this is the time of the bit wars. So, the Nintendo and the original Sega were 8-bit. And then all of a sudden, along comes the Sega Mega Drive, 16-bit, and can do what Nintendo don't. And was a great advertising campaign back then. If you've ever bored, look up old 80s console ads. You won't be disappointed. There's some batshit crazy ones out there, but they all basically wanted to get a 12-year-old to separate his parents from his money to get one of these consoles, and they did really well. It also had a thing called the Mode 7 chip, which allowed crude 3D graphics. Not talking about, like texture mapped or beautiful open worlds. I'm talking about just the geometric shapes. If anyone remembers the early 3D games that were, like a car was a box with two rectangles on it for the front and the back, and, horrible looking wheels that look like 50-cent coins. That's what I'm talking about. And it was touted as the 3D console, and there was a game called Star Fox, which really, really pushed the Super Nintendo to its limits and had a special chip inside the cartridge to even help it go further. And it was amazingly popular, amazingly addictive, and I owned that personally. And it was a space shooter in 3D. So you basically start out on a planet and you fly around, you blow up enemies, and you go into space, and had a great story. And you were a fox in space.
Isn't that where they come from?
In fighting amongst the stars. So basically that's why it's called Star Fox. And then you had your wingmen who were a frog, a dog, and like a beaver or something. I can't remember, but I do remember, like, if you got shot up or they were getting shot, you had to go and help them, and they'd cry out for help. And it was the four of you flying around, and it would always be like, they couldn't have speech synthesis back then, so the noise they made when they cried out for help was like, and I'll never forget that noise, because one of the guys, Slippy the Frog, was fucking hopeless. He got killed all the time. His AI was just shit. And so every 30 seconds. Anyway, I digress. Basically, it had more colours. It could move more sprites around, bigger sprites as well. So Mario could be made bigger on the screen. It looked sexier. It was all nice and rounded and had a great aesthetic, whereas the original Nintendo was a box. Controllers had more buttons. This is the first time we saw shoulder buttons on a controller as well. So another innovation there from Nintendo. And better sound. And of course, it had the new Super Mario Brothers game on it. And what a game that was.
So essentially it was harder, better, faster, stronger?
Absolutely. 96 levels. The introduction of Yoshi, the introduction of Mode 7 chip was used in it a little bit as well in certain scenes. I probably can't spoil anything for a 30-year-old game, but when you got to Bowser and when you got to some of the Koopa kids and things, they'd actually zoom in and out of the screen, albeit very blockily, but they sort of did that 3D zoom thing. The music was absolutely amazing. It had a save function, and it was just better. In my opinion, probably the best Super Mario Brothers game ever released, and that's going to create a lot of talk on the subreddit, no doubt, because people are going to just trounce me and say Super Mario 64, and I'm going to say no, Super Mario World. This is the game that made you actually have to sacrifice Yoshi to a yawning chasm to get the 96th world and say, I have got all of them. Because on your save file, it tells you how many worlds you've found. Once you find 96, it goes blue to indicate that you've clocked over the game. So a lot of the worlds were hidden, very hard to get to. And we didn't have the internet. We didn't have online guides back then. You just had to find them. But again, I digress. Basically, better graphics, better sound, and better Mario. And that was enough for Nintendo. They sold a boatload of these things.
So the SNES has 21 games, obviously out of a large catalogue of games.
Absolutely.
Out of the 21 that did make the cut, what are your highlights from it?
All right, so obviously we'd have to say that one of those highlights would be Super Mario World. I've just gushed all over about it a minute ago, so I won't go back over that. Another one of my massive favourites that was on there is The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, which is the 16-bit version of The Legend of Zelda. Another amazing game that I sank hours and hours and hours into playing. It was the game I actually got with my Super Nintendo. It was a Christmas present, and I got to pick one game that I could have with it, and it was Legend of Zelda. The actual Nintendo was boxed with Super Mario World, so I had that as well, but the game I picked was Legend of Zelda, and it was probably the greatest pick. Because I never, ever tired of it, and I love that game so much. So there's that. A game called Secret of Mana. Now, that is, for those who don't know, another Square Enix game. They're the guys that make Final Fantasy. It was actually an Enix game back then. It was before Square Enix became Square Enix, and it's a game in the vein of Final Fantasy, but has a great story and slightly different game mechanics in it. It's recently been re-released on Steam as a 3D enhanced version, and it's been universally pantsed because Square Enix fucked it up, which makes me sad on the inside because it was one of my favourite games. I actually have it on my mobile. They re-released it for mobile a few years ago. I still play it to this day, but another top-down RPG game. Another game, breaking tradition here for for me, but definitely Street Fighter 2 Turbo. I grew up in the time of arcades, and the king of the arcades, without a doubt, was Street Fighter 2. If you couldn't Hadouken, then GTFO. You had to play Street Fighter, and Street Fighter was everywhere. Everyone loved Street Fighter. Everyone had their own character that they'd main and, learn all the moves for. Go to an arcade and you'd put your 50 cents or $1 in, or your 20 cents if you were lucky enough to have an arcade that was only 20 cents, and you'd start playing Street Fighter, and then some dude would come up beside you and put his 20 cents in and then just totally wipe the floor with you, and then he'd own the machine and you'd have to go. And we waited with bated breath until we could get the home version so we could practice day in and day out and hopefully go back to the arcade and kick that guy's ass, which never happened. I still play Street Fighter 4 and 5 to this day as well, so definitely a game that's moulded me. And Turbo Edition was better than the original Street Fighter 2 because you had the addition of the 4 bosses, so Bison, Vega, Balrog, and Sagat. The last one on my list would be Final Fantasy III. Now, this is what we talked about earlier, Dan. Final Fantasy III is actually Final Fantasy IV. So they kind of skipped a couple of Final Fantasies, and they ballsed up the naming convention because they'd already released a couple of Final Fantasies in the West. They skipped a couple, and then they thought, well, we're not going to call it Final Fantasy IV because everyone would be confused because we stopped at Final Fantasy 2, so we're going to have to call it Final Fantasy 3. And that's a whole nother podcast we could do on the naming of Final Fantasy and just Final Fantasy in general. But basically Final Fantasy 3/4, they're all now available on Steam and virtual consoles and stuff with the right names and the right numbers. So that's my top 5. And I mean, special mention, I know I'm going to go to the top 6, but special mention to Star Fox and Star Fox 2. Now, Star Fox 2 it's the Super Nintendo Classic is touted as having 20 plus 1 games. And the plus 1 is Star Fox 2, which was never ever released. It was developed, it was nearly finished, and then basically Nintendo never released it. So they found the original files, they cleaned them up, they got them to a working state, and they actually put it on as the bonus game on the Super Nintendo Classic. So special mention to those two.
One of the things I will note about your top 5 there is that these are all games that are still going to this present day. Street Fighter is now up to Street Fighter 5 with the multiple versions that are coming out for it. Mario, well, we don't even need to mention Mario. Everyone knows what Mario is. And same with Zelda. Zelda on the Switch, probably the biggest and most popular of all the games that came out on there. And Square Enix still making, Final Fantasy and that style game to this day. The top 5 from back then is still going on today.
And exactly right. That's what I said earlier, is that Nintendo made gaming today. And a lot of the companies that are still around today churning out games are the same companies that were churning out games for the original Nintendo. And it's probably a bit of a bone of contention because people will say, no, the Atari 2600 started gaming. Everyone's got their own opinion, but Nintendo was mainstream, and a lot of companies that started making stuff for Nintendo are still making stuff.
Well, I will say that with my top 5, it's not too different. I will throw a shout out to Mario Kart because I don't think there's ever been a bad Mario Kart ever made. And it's still just one of those classic memories that we have. Maybe not as classic as on the 64, but still classic memories. And Donkey Kong Country. I still love Donkey Kong to this day, whether it's the original Carpenter Mario going up ladders or the Donkey Kong Country style games that came afterwards. I love all of them, and I will always happily go back to those kind of things.
And again, a lot of the games on your list are still going. Donkey Kong Country. We haven't seen a new Donkey Kong game for a while. But Mario Kart's definitely still out there. We're up to Mario Kart 8 on the Switch.
Yep, Mario lives strong, and Donkey Kong will never die.
Mario Kart, one of the few games where the computer can cheat and get away with it. And probably responsible for more broken controllers than anything else. I would think. Maybe with the exception of Dark Souls, but fuck Dark Souls. It's too hard. Okay, so the SNES and the NES Mini.
Now, I will say on the previous podcast we have, and even on our retro Let's Play, you've mentioned the Raspberry Pi. It's something I've never touched myself, but I have experienced a little bit at your house, and I do have a mate's house that has one running as well. Now, before the minis or the classics that came out, the Pi was what people were using to get the old school games running up into today. Can you tell us a bit about it, why people should look at one or the other, and what it's all about?
Yep. Okay, so the Raspberry Pi is a small single board computer. Okay, so it's a tiny little board that has a complete computer built into it. it was never intended as a machine to run Nintendo and Sega emulation games or emulate, retro games. It was intended to be used as an embedded controller for things. So, like, if you've got a pump, you could make one of these tiny, inexpensive little computers, the controller, and connect it via Ethernet and leave it running. They run a flavour of Linux, which is an open source software, and people discovered that they were really, really good at running old 8-bit emulators. So, a whole community was born around the Raspberry Pi and what was called, most popularly, Emulation Station, which is an operating system that's built on top of Linux and runs things, emulators called RetroArch cores. Now, I'm not going to bore you with all of that. We'll talk about that maybe in another episode. Long story short is, if you can get the images or the ROM files of basically any retro console before the PlayStation 2 and put them on a memory stick, run the Emulation Station program, and put them on your Raspberry Pi, you will get a decent emulation experience. Now, we talked about the hardware of the NES Minis, classic NESs before. The original Raspberry Pi wasn't much more powerful than the hardware that is running the Super Nintendo Classic and the Nintendo Classic. They're up to their third iteration now, and they've got much more powerful. They've got Wi-Fi and Bluetooth added into them now. But back in the day, they were just an inexpensive computer, and they're only around 25 to 30 Australian dollars. So they really didn't cost much. And now we've got a pared down version, which is even smaller, called the Raspberry Pi Zero, which you can pick up for about $8. And it'll happily emulate Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Game Boy, Sega, Mega Drive, those old systems. Now, it's not plug and play, okay? So you do need to know a little bit about how to set it up. And you do need to have patience with it. And you do need to realize that it's not endorsed by any of the companies. If you buy a Raspberry Pi, none of this software comes with it. You have to source it yourself. You have to get the ROM files as well, so the game files. And that's a questionable grey area in the law as to whether you get legitimate backups of the cartridges that you own, and only those cartridges, or whether you go out on the high seas and go to a certain bay where there may be buccaneers or pirates and get all of the ROM files for this thing and shove them on a memory card, and 16 gigs, more than enough to fit everything on there that you could ever want, and emulate them away and know that, they're going to crash. Some aren't going to work flat out. You're going to open up the ROM, it's going to go to a black screen. Some are going to work perfectly, and some are going to work like dog's balls, or some of the sprites might be invisible, or the music might be fuzzy, or it might not work at all. So it's more of a hobby. It's not just like going out and buying an old school Nintendo with a box full of games and giving the cartridges a bit of a clean and blowing on the connectors and plugging it in, and away you go. The Retro Pi demands more love and more time. But in my experience, I've been tinkering with Raspberry Pis for probably the last 3 years. They will give you hours of enjoyment if you do want to put in the time, some of the frustration into them. So, and there's plenty of forums out there where people will give you a hand. You can get pre-built full images that you can just download and put onto a Raspberry Pi, and it will work. You can customize it to your heart's content as well. These little Raspberry Pis do output in HDMI, so you can plug them directly into a telly. And you can plug USB controllers into them, so you can buy USB adapters to use your old controllers, or you can buy USB Nintendo-style controllers. You can use the 8-bit Do controllers. Mm-hmm. But the Raspberry Pi is a tinkerer's machine. And you see, eBay, Facebook, and some other places, people selling pre-built arcade machines, or the big plank that's got the joysticks and the buttons in it and just plugs into your telly and plays a million arcade games. The likelihood is there's a Raspberry Pi inside.
So essentially, if you are looking at the two different devices and which way to go, the classics or the minis, however you want to term them, mm-hmm. they're better for someone who wants to plug, play instantly, have a bit of fun, play, the premium selection of games and just have a good time. Whereas the Pi is something that is more for people who are a bit more tech savvy and have a lot more time, that are willing to spend a couple of hours tinkering around and making sure it is stable enough to work, understanding that even then it may still not work as perfectly as, the classics.
Why don't we have both? There's a big argument to be made against collection versus emulation, and I think we're going to do an episode really soon on collecting retro stuff, so I won't go down the slippery slope that is collection versus emulation, but honestly, if you want something that's easy that you can plug straight into, you can play now, get a classic.
All right, well, just to wrap this up, we've talked a lot about the consoles, what's on them and that. How much do they cost? Where do we get them? Should I get one?
Okay, yes, you should get one. Just because you can. Problem is you won't get an NES Classic. They came out a couple of Christmases ago. They were about 120 odd Australian dollars. However, they sold out within minutes. And good luck buying one now for anywhere between 300, 400, 500 Australian dollars up. Because unfortunately, fuckwits bought like a crate of them and put them straight on eBay for massive profit. And Nintendo didn't make a heap of them. They were a limited edition. So realistically, the NES Mini or the NES Classic, you're not going to buy a new one. You're not going to go down to EB Games or get online and buy a new one from a retailer. You're going to have to buy it secondhand, and you're going to get scalped.
Yep.
The SNES Mini, EB Games still do have a little bit of stock at selected stores. They don't have many left. Again, it was a limited release, but the nostalgia level may have died down a little bit. They weren't as amazingly super popular this time around. I mean, they still were very popular, but there is a little bit of stock left around. You may be able to walk into your local EB Games and buy one, or, Big W or Target might have a dusty one sitting on a shelf somewhere. And they were the same price, 120 odd Australian dollars. You probably get on eBay, for maybe $200, because people do like to scalp these sort of things. So, is
there a reason why they were so limited in release?
I don't know. Nintendo could have sold quadruple the amount that they did, at least with the NES Mini or the NES Classic. I don't know why they didn't. I guess they wanted to make it something a little bit special. Something that someone could say, I have one of these mini NESs. And, I got one. I pre-ordered it. I stood in line for 3 hours at the local game shop and I got one. I guess they didn't have to make them, is the thing. So they didn't have to, make enough to meet supply and demand. I think they're kind of the old leave them wanting more adage, I think, maybe a little bit. So they made limited releases, and then they sort of did another limited release a little bit after the first release, and they got snapped up and everyone loved them. And they did the same thing with the Super Nintendo Classic as well. And they got pretty well received. And I mean, there's not many left.
Thanks everyone for listening to another episode of the Soap. Aaron, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge on this episode. We know you're the expert in this kind of area, so thank you so much for joining us. As always, make sure to follow us across Facebook, YouTube, and that to make sure that you get the latest episodes when they come out. We are doing a bit of a push to get our followers up, so jump on the competition. You will find it on our Reddit or on our Facebook. Jump on the competition, give us a like and a subscribe, and we hope you join us for the next episode.
When you get hold of the Nintendo Entertainment System, when you master Rob the Video Robot and meet the challenge of Gyromite, when you shoot the light-sensing Zapper, when you play the system with the most arcade hits, you're playing with power. The Nintendo Entertainment System. Now you're playing with power.